Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Economic fragility, government corruption, violence, and increasingly climate change are forcing migration in record numbers from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to the US southern border. The coronavirus pandemic, which has disproportionately affected Latin America in public health and economic terms, coupled with two hurricanes back to back last fall, have deeply affected many Northern Triangle residents. Today, the panel will explore the policy challenges and opportunities to address the key drivers of Central American migration. Even more important, we will go beyond the headlines and elevate the voices of some of the migrants themselves. It is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle, Ricardo Zuniga. Ricardo is a career member of the US Senior Foreign Service. He was named as Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle this past March. Previous assignments include service as US Consul in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council. Mr. Zuniga's leadership at the State Department, along with Vice President Harris, is already showing new ways in which the US government can partner to build a more prosperous future for Central Americans in their own homeland. I look forward to hearing Ricardo's vision for the future of the region and policy solutions to these critical issues. And now, over to Maria Fernandez Bosmansky, otherwise known as Mafe, Deputy Director for the programs with the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, who will moderate the conversation with Special Envoy Zuniga.
Thank you, Adrienne. It's always wonderful when you can join us for our events. Thank you also, Special Envoy Zuniga, for being here with us. And for those who are joining across our different platforms, this conversation is on the record, and we want to invite you to be a part of it. Special Envoy Zuniga will take questions from the public, so feel free to send them via Zoom in the chat or using our hashtag AC Central America. Special Envoy Zuniga, before we dive into it, I want to thank you for leading US diplomatic efforts to improve conditions on the ground. Your leadership is much needed at this moment of unprecedented and multidimensional crisis in the region, which, as Adrienne was saying, are leading to unprecedented numbers of migration. So let me kick it off with an easy question for you. Special Envoy Zuniga, what is, in your opinion, what is most needed from the private, public, civil society, and multilateral sectors to address the driving factors of migration?
Mafet, thank you so much for that. And Adrienne, thank you for that introduction. It really is an honor to be here and with so many good friends. So I appreciate the chance to talk about this. I think Adrienne teed it up very well. We're talking about a really comprehensive problem that requires a comprehensive solution. I think many of us who are working on this issue now are very familiar with it because we dealt with this in 2014 when we had the first major flow of unaccompanied migrant children from especially Guatemala at that time to the US southern border. In that period, I think it's important to note that we've learned one very important fact, that this is not just an episode. This is now a dynamic. This is, it's also not just in the case of this region, Central America and the United States. In many ways, this is the age of mass migration. When we look at one of the largest migrations underway, it's really Venezuela into other countries around the region because of the collapse of the state and society in Venezuela. In the case of Central America, I think we've also, we're having to come to terms with the fact that this is going to continue until conditions change on the ground, especially in the case of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. These are not small countries, it's 32 million people. And so it's a community and a movement and a dynamic that affects Mexico, just as it affects the United States. So when we talk about a whole of society approach on our side, we need to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve and really narrow this down to our primary objectives and identifying the primary problems that we're trying to contend with. Probably the most important from the perspective of the Biden administration is the issue of governance, and that is weak governance, corruption, the inability of citizens to feel like their voices are heard or like they have a chance to succeed in their own communities, in their own countries, as Adrian said. And our view is that working with the private sector, working with civil society, working with governments, working with other representatives in the international community, other countries, multilateral development banks, we need to tackle this question of governance head on. And in many ways, that doesn't just involve corruption. It means improved oversight of national services so that people can have the schools, they can have the security, and they can have the healthcare that societies everywhere demand. And that, in those spaces, we can help. It's often said that this is a matter of political will and that we can't want it more than people in Central America do. Well, I think one thing we can say is we are sure that people in Central America want this as much, if not more, than we do. We should not mistake the desire of a fairly small group of people to maintain the status quo from the desires of the population. We are aligned with popular support for anti-impunity and anti-corruption efforts, for national development, for creating opportunities through the private sector and opening those up as much as possible. We want to see ourselves, and I think we have to start with the perspective that we are on the side of popular opinion in Central America. And part of that also involves dealing with not just promoting economic growth in Central America, but also stimulating possibilities for legal migration, what we call additional new avenues for legal migration from Central America. And lastly, I would just say we also need to attend to major problems that may not have gotten the attention that they deserved, like gender-based violence. In the case of El Salvador and Honduras, these are countries with some of the highest femicide rates in the world. Those are underlying factors. Those are root causes, and those are causes that we need to deal with partners on the ground.
Special Envoy Zuniga, you mentioned 2014, you mentioned political will, you mentioned citizens wanting this more than we do. Can you tell us the top 3 ways in which the United States is engaging differently this time than in 2014? What would you say are the top 3 different engagements?
Well, I would say that's a great question. So I would say the first is that we do envision a greater role and a greater focus on job creation in Central America to the extent that's possible. We see that as crucial to the effort. And that means not just focusing on economic growth, but on more equitable economic growth. And we understand that we do need to put additional focus at this point on the small and medium-sized enterprises that employ 70% or more of the population in Central America. And that we also need to consider the distribution of wealth is an important factor. In fact, inequity is one of the main drivers. Lack of opportunity is one of the main drivers. Some of that had been getting reduced, but we do need to continue to focus there. That's one point, that focus on economics. A second is to put this effort on anti-corruption and governance at the center of our work. At the time, in 2014, we had CICIG was well underway in Guatemala. That was something that had enjoyed strong support from the United States across multiple administrations. We had the beginnings of MAXI, the anti-impunity mission in Honduras with the support of the OAS. And we had very strong attorneys general in El Salvador that we had helped carry on their anti-corruption missions. At that point, we had good partnerships and we had strong vehicles for driving that forward. Now, unfortunately, those efforts have been dismantled. And so we understand that unless we're able to put that at the center and make progress on those governance issues, progress on the economic and security front will never stand up. So that's a second point. And the third is, frankly, that we have a lessons learned approach that we may not have had as much of in 2014. Part of that has to do with learning that's taken place over the last 6 years, including the need to focus on anti-violence efforts as part of your security package and part of your security efforts. So that means dealing with, using interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy that maybe didn't have the same level of attention or support 6 years ago, but that we've learned is really important. Or for example, using a place-based approach of having a highly integrated effort in a community, in a given community, to try to achieve that progress. There are other ways, but those are three that really leap to mind for me.
Thank you. In a similar vein, what were the main takeaways from your recent trip to Guatemala and El Salvador, including new opportunities to cooperate with regional governments and stakeholders?
So one thing that's clear is when we talk about what we're trying to do in Central America right now on an immediate basis, one is to communicate that the border is going to be secured by the United States, and so that it's not worth attempting the irregular migration. The second is that if there are protection needs, particularly for those seeking asylum by traveling to the United States, we are working to establish alternatives to coming to the border by working with the UNHCR and with governments in the region to help develop access to protection in the region as opposed to having to come all the way to the United States. And the third is that we're trying to message that we are going to be committed to the development of Central America so that there's a reason to hope and a reason to believe that conditions will improve and that they should wait a little longer before traveling. What we find is, especially on that second point, the area work on collaborative efforts to establish protection and establish humane and safe and legal migration. Those are areas where we've made some progress. We also, I think, have made enormous progress in terms of rallying international support for humanitarian response to the hurricane, unfortunately, the people displaced by the hurricane, and by the people who've been displaced by the pandemic, because COVID is the other big factor at play right now in terms of driving acute bad humanitarian conditions and poor humanitarian conditions in Central America. So what we see is that there are opportunities. We do have partners in civil society, in the private sector, and in the public sector, and in international organizations that want to work with us to finally resolve some of these longstanding issues. And we don't want to oversell this. We're talking about beginning to resolve these deep structural problems.
Special Envoy, you were just talking about it's not the time to come, and that's a message that you have been communicating. I have a question from the audience. Randy Pestana with FIU asks, how can you spread a message of hope to Central Americans considering migration, as opposed to the current messaging of do not come back, you will be sent, it's not the time? What would you say to that?
So I think it's interesting because for many people who are, and this is a point I think that's really important to underscore, people who are migrating, they're often traveling because they have aspirations, they have hopes, but their hopes can't be realized in their home countries. They believe that the only way that they can realize their dreams is by leaving. And in fact, what I have heard several times is that in many communities, it is a culture of migration, where the expectation is that when young men and women reach a certain age, they will travel to the United States to work and to move permanently if they can. We don't have enough circular migration. So I would say, first of all, we understand that one thing that we need to do is put more legal pathways so that you can have opportunities for temporary labor, or so that in the case of people who have family reunification opportunities in the United States, that those are possible through regular means. There's no belief here that all migration from Central America is going to stop. In fact, that's not the objective. There is going to be legal migration because we have an enormous community from Central America living in the United States. Our belief, though, is that, again, these are not small countries. It's 32 million people. About 9 million of them are in very precarious humanitarian conditions. We have an obligation, really, as a part of this community, to try to improve conditions there as a starting point. We also think it's in the interest of the United States to have strong, stable societies for reasons that are not just have less to do with migration. For example, CAFTA DR countries are the third largest US market in the region. Imagine if the situation were stable and prosperous. So there's multiple reasons that favor development there. And in terms of hope, we agree there has to be a logic for that. And that's why we want to start with governance and job promotion.
Thank you, Special Envoy. As part of your role, you are also the liaison with Congress. And we saw recently, just yesterday, the White House announced the big humanitarian assistance going towards Central America to help with humanitarian relief and to address food insecurity. Can you talk a little bit about what other things are in the works with Congress to help address the situation on the ground? You were also just talking about hopes and aspirations, and it really comes down to making the conditions on the ground livable and conditions where people can thrive. How can Congress help with that?
Well, that's a really key point. I have been interacting quite a bit with Congress, and one thing I found is that regardless of views on the issue of the border or on migration policy, there's enormous bipartisan support for dealing with the root causes, broadly defined. So I think there's an understanding among both Republicans and Democrats that people have to have a reason to want to build their lives in their home country. So there's a lot of support, for example, for legislation that supports the role of the Development Finance Corporation, which is going to be an important tool for this administration to use in terms of supporting private investment and the use of private lending to support what we're doing through multilateral development banks. So I'd say that clearly is something that's going to be very important going forward. And there are other areas where Congress wants to make sure that there is equity and support. This effort against corruption and in favor of governance is strongly supported by the Congress. In fact, we have a number of congressional mandates and requirements to put a higher focus on issues related to corruption and corrupt actors.
And on that last point of corrupt actors and anti-corruption measures, which we recognize as a big and important message of the Biden administration, how will the United States leverage tools, legal, diplomatic, even economic tools, while bringing new regional actors to the table to ensure the implementation of anti-corruption measures?
So I think it's really important here to highlight that we are making use of authorities that exist through the Department of Justice, through the Department of State, through the Treasury. Yesterday, we announced the designation of 2 citizens of Guatemala who were involved in essentially trying to manipulate the selection of judges in Guatemala that the U.S. determined was contrary to our national interest because it was in the furtherance of corruption. We are going to continue to take actions like that on a unilateral basis, but it's the most important thing the United States can do is provide political support and protection to the extent possible for prosecutors and actors in Central America who are doing not just in government, but also in civil society and in the private sector. There are many proponents of exactly these types of measures because we're talking about people who are living, these are the victims of corruption in so many cases. And so the number one thing that we're going to do is work with authorities and other actors in Central America who are trying to advance this cause of transparency and anti-corruption, again, for the purpose of creating the enabling conditions so that there can be economic growth and broad-based economic growth.
Thank you. There's a really, I think, great question in the Q&A. We're starting to get some. I encourage you to keep those coming because we will be taking them. This one from Mark Botsford about fighting disinformation around this issue going forward. I'm sure that that's something you've come across and that's something that you're still working through. It's a never-ending problem, the problem of disinformation. Can you talk about that?
So if it has to do with disinformation around whether the border is open, that's one of the hardest things that you can do, because very often the people who are involved in communities who are involved in facilitating irregular migration are people who are known to the community. And information travels on Facebook in Central America more than almost any other platform. And it's hard to compete against that. And so there needs to be very clear indications that you're enforcing your border, but also that you are present to try to improve conditions. So that means that's a part of my job as well. And that involves not just my messaging, but asking others to help with that messaging. But people messaging is only as powerful as you can back it up with action. And with real life improvements, with real life opportunities for regular migration, for legal pathways, and some, again, reason to hope that conditions might change in countries so that people have a reason to build their futures and to kind of carry out their aspirations at home.
I think what you just said about actions speaking louder than words is so true, and especially in this case. And we've seen already how the Biden administration is working with partners and allies here, but also in the region and also globally to address this problem. I want to shift gears a little bit. Another question here from the audience, talking about victims of gang violence that have difficulty winning asylum under the existing classes of persecuted groups outlined by the 1980 Refugee Act. A large number of Central American asylum seekers are deported back to their deaths, violating non-refoulement principles. How can the American asylum system and governments of the Northern Triangle address this problem?
Well, I think that is one of the most challenging situations we face, because the law and conventions contemplated a different set of drivers. And I think that did not perhaps contemplate the kind of the social and criminal environment that people live in today. I would also note that, for example, it is true that homicide rates have declined in Central America over recent years. It's also true that people feel violence in different ways. So, for example, extortion is how many people in El Salvador continue to feel violence or insecurity across the region. Gender-based violence is one of the highest forms of violence. And unfortunately, the conventions and our own legal process does not contemplate asylum for all the people who have all of the various social drivers that exist today and criminal drivers that exist today. So our commitment has to be to provide as much access to protection screening as there can possibly be, while we also work to deal with this whole range of social violence that exists in Central America beyond just the gangs, because the fact is there are other very significant drivers of insecurity in Central America.
Thank you, Special Envoy. I also got another question, and I'll get back to what you were talking about economics earlier being one of the top priorities for the Biden administration, along with anti-corruption being at the center of the work and the lessons learned approach. As we have explored in recent Atlantic Council reports, and you just said yourself, there is a lack of economic opportunities in the formal sector. What would you say are low-hanging fruit for working with the Central American private sector to unlock economic opportunities. It's not all about working with the governments and civil society. The national private sector also plays a huge role in this dilemma. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that's a very important part to focus on. For example, the provision of banking services can transform people's lives. The vice president in particular has really advanced the notion of using technology to leapfrog opportunities in communities that may not have access to landlines, for example, but where cell access is quite possible. And where so much of the population and the informal sector doesn't have access to banking, doesn't have access to the possibility of reaching export markets if they're small agricultural producers. And yet some of those things can be accomplished even through small scale work. And those are areas that we want to focus on. The private sector itself has, I think, valuable ideas for improving education for people coming into the workforce that exists in Central America, and that workforce preparation is crucial. But so is taking the moment right now in the international trading arena to see if there are opportunities that have not been explored in the past. Nearshoring is a term that's tossed around. The reality is that the markets are likely to drive much of the production to other parts of Asia, not from China to the Americas. So there needs to be consideration of, is there a deliberate approach that can be used to take advantage of geography and other advantages that exist? And are there changes that need to be made to international finance? Can more use be made of the Development Finance Corporation? We are doing that already. The DFC, working with CABE, the Bank for Economic Integration in Central America, provided $100 million for companies, small and medium enterprises, to have access to financing to survive the pandemic. And that 100 million spread across 3 countries, you would not think would go far. But when you're talking about the scale of businesses that we're assisting, it actually does make a difference in a lot of communities and in terms of people being able to maintain employment. So those kinds of efforts, making financing available to people who are in the small and medium sector, finding ways to assist with formalization, finding ways to provide banking, these are all ways to pull a larger percentage of the population into the formal sector and into having greater opportunities.
Thank you, Special Envoy Zuniga. Our time has come to an end. I want to thank you for being here with us tonight, offer our partnership at the Atlantic Council as you continue with your important work as well. But for all of you who are tuning in at home or from the road, from the office, wherever you are, don't go anywhere. We're now going to watch a powerful video put together by the Atlantic Council with footage from the International Federation of the Red Cross. After the video, my colleague, Rebecca Shire, the Director of Humanitarian Initiatives with the Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, will share some comments with us before our next live conversation. Special Envoy Zuniga, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Nosotros con mis hermanos y amigos salimos con la esperanza de poder llegar a los Estados Unidos, pues lamentablemente no todo nos salió como esperábamos. Desde que salimos de aquí de Honduras, saliendo del país, todo marchaba bien hasta que llegamos a Guatemala. Bueno, en Guatemala se nos complicó todo, ¿no? Montamos un autobús. Desde ahí, en el autobús, las autoridades nos bajaron, nos pidieron cierta cantidad de dinero, 1,700 quetzales nos pidieron. Pagamos la cantidad y, bueno, de ahí para allá todo marchó mal. Ellos vinieron, nos bajaron del autobús como que fuéramos delincuentes, ¿no? Y después de eso casi nos arrestan. Bueno, gracias a Dios ellos nos dejaron en libertad y ya quedamos sin dinero, sin nada y nos tocó decidir caminar, irnos aventurando en el camino porque ya volver atrás ya no queríamos porque tampoco teníamos dinero para poder regresar. Y decidimos aventurar, nos fuimos con mis amigos y mis hermanos. Cuando llegamos en lo que es a México, lamentablemente casi perdemos la vida. Llegamos a un lugar que se llama Tenosique, Tabasco, donde pandilleros nos capturaron, nos pusieron pistolas en la cabeza, andaban con machete, bates y nos pidieron que le diéramos todo lo que teníamos, nuestras pertenencias. Y ya nosotros ya no contábamos con nada, ni teléfono para poderle avisar a nuestros parientes en la situación en la que nos encontrábamos. Bueno, ahí solo Dios con nosotros. Le rogábamos a Dios que por lo menos ellos no nos quitaran la vida. Y en todo eso, ellos vinieron, nos desnudaron, nos quitaron el dinero y bueno, lo poco que andábamos ya lo quitaron y de ahí para allá ellos dijeron que nos iban a quitar la vida. Solo le pedimos a Dios que Él velara por nuestras vidas. Y gracias a Él, pues, ellos nos soltaron y gracias a Dios estamos aquí, ¿no? Son cosas que uno no pide que le pasen esas cosas. A veces nosotros los emigrantes salimos del país porque la falta de desempleo, ¿ya me entiende? Así como se hallan personas buenas en el camino, así se hallan más personas malas, ¿no? Personas de que desde que miran a uno de inmigrante, oh, ese es inmigrante, ¿ah? De todos modos, él no es de aquí, no vale nada, aquí nomás puede quedar, ¿ah? Esos son los riesgos que uno de inmigrante sufre.
Thank you, Mafe, and thank you again to the International Federation for Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in the Americas, to the Honduran Red Cross, and of course to Jorge, who shared a very harrowing and arduous portrayal of his journey, unfortunately one that's replete with risks that many migrants face on the road. It's sometimes hard to think about the individuals when we see these headlines in the news. We forget sometimes these are mothers and fathers. They have their children and teenagers with them. Sometimes they're traveling alone. They're people like us who either chose to leave all they have and all they know behind them for greater opportunity, as you've heard before, or they were forced to leave, and sometimes by compounding risks. In this next session, you will hear more about the drivers behind migration in the Americas and the Northern Triangle in particular. And I'd like to just highlight the issue of climate migration, because this is an underlying risk that is profound and it's exacerbating risks across the board. Rising temperatures, of course, are leading to more coastal flooding. We've seen an increase in droughts and the frequency and severity. And of course, I think all of you remember the hurricanes Iota and Eta that hit last fall and quickly displaced 500,000 people, not to mention took the lives of 200 people and put over 5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So the more we understand the risks that are behind this displacement we're seeing, the more apt we are to find solutions and lasting solutions, and some of which you've heard today from Special Envoy Zuniga, in particular around economic opportunity that we could foster and working closely with local governments and local communities. There are few people better positioned to talk about the situation, the risks that many of these people face at the front line than Walter Cote. He is the special representative of the Secretary General for COVID-19, the head of delegation and permanent observer to the UN for the International Federation for Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And Walter has championed many efforts over the years to really address vulnerabilities he and his team of local Red Cross face, one of which we are supporting, the humanitarian service points. This is an initiative that walks alongside migrants to provide emergency care, everything from food, water, and shelter to protection, psychosocial support, and trusted information. And you will also hear perspective from other very highly esteemed colleagues. So allow me to introduce the moderator for the next session, Ms. Alexandra Colón-Amil, who comes to us as a very highly acclaimed journalist and executive producer of Efecto 9. Over to you, Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you, y muchas gracias. Es un placer saludarlos a todos.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to say hello to you and to be part of this excellent conversation. And without further ado, I want to introduce our other panelists this afternoon. Already mentioned was Walter Cote, but we also have Marcos Andrés Antil, founder of the digital marketing company Sumac, and also an author of the book Migrante. We also have with us Oscar Martinez, editor-in-chief of El Faro, the first digital newspaper in Latin America, and he's the author of several books, including Los Migrantes que no importan, which has received great critical acclaim. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to begin with your book, Oscar, The Migrants That Do Not Matter. This was published 10 years ago. Your work as a journalist has enabled you to be engaged and investigate closely these issues surrounding migration. From your perspective, how have the realities surrounding migration changed since you published this book 10 years ago? Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alexandra, for your question. The sad thing about this book, which was published back in 2010, is that it's actually still relevant, which is the worst thing that could be said of this book. It's describing a humanitarian crisis suffered by tens of thousands of people every year, and the problem remains. Yes, there have been some changes, but they're more around the edges. Some Mexican police that were kidnapping migrants are no longer around. The Zetas who were doing mass kidnappings along the route have moved northward, but then other criminal groups have come to replace them. Some routes have changed owing to pressures applied by the Mexican government, and some crossing points have changed. But the general truths, the horrors described in the book, the sexual assault and rapes, which are a daily thing, being tricked by the coyotes, organized crime, migrants being charged to go through Mexico, corruption among Mexican and Central American police, all of it's still there. It's happening right now as we speak. To provide a simple example, I'm convinced that as we are speaking right now in Mexico, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of migrants kidnapped, waiting for their relatives, usually the ones who managed to make it to the U.S., pay their ransom so that they aren't killed by these criminal groups. So that's what I would say to answer your question. The paths of people desperately fleeing the Northern Triangle and the terrible living conditions for the working class, they still pose a major humanitarian crisis, very similar to what I described 10 years ago in that book. Another reality that hasn't changed is migration among young people. Marcos, you know of a case that exemplifies this. In 2019, you published Migrante, which was autobiographical. You shared how, as a preteen, you traveled to the U.S. fleeing armed conflict in Guatemala. And I'd like to know, what would you say to the young people that we are seeing now trying to make the same journey that you made back then?
Gracias, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra, for the question, and to the Atlantic Council for inviting me.
Yo creo que para las personas que deciden tomar este riesgo,
I think that for those who decide to assume this risk, trying to tell them to not do it is hard because it's forced migration. And migrating shouldn't be the first option. It should be a last resort. They need to take care of themselves, honor their roots, to dream, and to remember that in their countries, such as Guatemala, Guatemala didn't push us out. It was circumstances created by corruption and impunity. They need to remember their people, and they should return to their country and create opportunities so that future generations don't have to suffer as we did. That's what I believe, and it's what I've done personally. But the situation is extremely difficult.
Marcos, quisiera que profundices un poco.
Marcos, I'd love for you to delve into that more.
Dar a tu país.
You have given back to your country. You focused a lot on education. Could you tell us a bit more about the work you're doing in this area and the role played by education in addressing the problems of migration?
Sí, Alexandra.
Yes, Alexandra. I had the opportunity once I was here to be able to graduate from university in computer science. And in 2004, I created a digital marketing company. And then in 2008, I decided to return to Guatemala and open up an office there because I knew there was a lot of talent there, a lot of young people who were dreamers, whose work was high quality, just as good, if not better. Our company right now has customers in more than 25 countries, and the largest companies in the world trust us with the work we do in Guatemala. And some come to Guatemala to train. So I knew the talent was there. So I wanted to return to create these opportunities. And also, Alexandra, to inspire them and to show them that it's okay to dream and that the best tool to realize their dreams are education, getting an education. And that's why I try to focus my efforts on education that reaches the most remote villages all the way to the cities, and that education be free. That's what our region needs. And with the powerful tool of education, we can create the Guatemalan dream, the Central American dream, or the Latin American dream. As the American dream exists, yes, I'm a product of that. But as Oscar is saying, that involves a great sacrifice. And many people were just burned alive by the process. So I do believe that education is the tool to achieve our dreams.
Thank you, Marcos. Walter, I would like to have you talk to us a little bit about the role that international organizations play, like the Red Cross, in providing assistance to these migrants. But first, let's talk a little bit about how the role of organizations like the Red Cross has changed in terms of providing this support to migrants in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I'm very pleased to be with you here. Even though this is a very sad topic, it's very complex. And it is the shared responsibility of all of those of us in the Americas, really in the world, but above all in the Americas. This is a situation that we could call a humanitarian multi-marathon. Just to give you an idea, in our particular case, the International Federation of the Red Cross, in the case of Central America, in the specific case of the 3 Northern Triangle countries, we have been engaged in a number of operations to provide assistance to the communities because of different epidemics, Zika, dengue, chikungunya, but also because of droughts or floods, and also associated with different types of violence, as well as different natural disasters that have impacted these communities. So you have hurricanes, you have earthquakes, but also the most recent 2 hurricanes. So if you look at all of that, you start to think, how does assistance to people work? How did it work back in the day when Hurricane Mitch hit Central America, where much of the aid was used, I would say, in a disorderly way. But the idea was to quickly try to address some of the impacts. But now there are so many simultaneous issues and fewer resources. In the case of COVID-19, we've had a budget for those 3 countries of approximately, just by way of example, our aid budget for those countries and for Central America was about $21 million or 23 million for direct support to these communities. But there was a financial gap, a budget gap, about $11 million. So we didn't get. But when it comes to migration, things are even worse. It's about $6 or $7 million that we had projected, but we only got a couple of million. So humanitarian aid and aid to people is changing. As long as migrants are in a situation that's based on violence and fear and terror, into this situation to be behind a wall, and then they take on paths that are very dangerous, inhospitable, like Marcos and Oscar were saying. These create even further risk for these people. So humanitarian aid has to change in all senses of the word, in terms of the strength of the discourse, to do more advocacy vis-a-vis the population, and to make sure that we can help them in their places of origin during the transit and in the countries of destination. We try to do that through different mechanisms. In Latin America, there are 200 sites where we provide assistance, structured assistance, and then we have mobile units as well. And one of those is supported by the Adrian Arsht Foundation Atlantic Council. This is all work that we do in partnership, but the association between public, private, and civil society is very important for humanitarian aid to the 3 countries, and also to work with Mexico, because we can't do any of this if we're not including Mexico, because the crisis in the Americas does not just lie in the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle. This is a machine that is churning out migrants on an ongoing basis. It's very dark, it's difficult. It leads to despair and desperation. 5.2 million people before COVID were living in extreme poverty and very difficult conditions. So imagine the situation now during COVID. It's at least double now. This is the situation we're up against now. Again, this machine that churns out migrants is working even harder, and it's creating even more problems. We have to do much more despite the fact that we've been working very hard, but there's very little integration, not enough assistance, and there's no clear addressing of the causes, the root causes. The challenge is huge, but fortunately, I believe there are opportunities. We can help people move from terror to hope, but this requires commitments, more resources, commitment. What Marco was saying is very important. Education, not just education for migrants, but also for those who are making them suffer even more. So education for police, for government leaders, for general society, that these are just human beings who had to leave a place. They were forced to leave, and that they have not committed any sin, any crime. The only sin is being poor. The challenge is enormous, and we have to be able to rise to the challenge. This massive challenge, does this include educating the countries of origin of migrants, but the population in general? And our time is almost up, but Oscar, I don't want to wrap up the conversation without asking you about something that you did at El Fardo, where you focused on the challenges that women migrants face in particular. Could you talk a little bit about those specific challenges that women migrants face? Well, first, women are fleeing from very extreme situations in Central America, and Northern Central America is very sexist. And so what women are up against is difficult. Their challenges are much bigger. They are a vulnerable group within an already vulnerable group. And on the journey, they're direct victims of a series of crimes. For example, the entire network of trafficking for sex work that is very strong in that part of Central America. I just did some investigative work in New York and trying to uncover the situation of migrants in the context of the pandemic. The situation is tragic, but it's even more so for women. Let me give you an example when it comes to work. Much of the migrant population who work in construction are still working. Practically all of the Central American women who were nannies or house cleaners or taking care of the elderly have lost their jobs without any income for approximately 1 year. It's a very complex situation. So they're victims with very specific conditions as part of a very vulnerable group, which are migrants. You can imagine the hell that Central American women face during the journey in their countries of origin and in the country of destination. Thank you, Oscar and Marcos and Walter, for your statements, for your responses. This has been very valuable information. Of course, there's a long road ahead. Unfortunately, our time is up. I will give the floor now to Cameron Clisholm, who is the Vice President of DT Data Institute.
Yeah, and thank you to all of today's participants, Special Envoy Zuniga, Rebecca, Walter, Marcos, Oscar. I understand that I am in the unenviable position of standing between many of you and the end of your workday, so I will keep my comments brief. In my role as Executive Vice President at DT Institute, I'd like to express our gratitude to the Atlantic Council for hosting this incredibly timely discussion. The knowledges and experiences shared today are critical to developing what we hope will be a holistic and long-term approach to the conditions in Central America that force men, women, and children to take the incredible risk of migration. DT Institute is proud to support these endeavors through the Northern Triangle Advisory Group, a strategic partnership, if you all hadn't heard, with the Adrian Arsh Latin American Center, where we are attempting to inform and generate support for innovative policy solutions that address the root causes of migration. Together with the Atlantic Council, we'll continue to work tirelessly to advance positive futures for our friends and partners in Central America. Thank you. And with that, I'll yield the floor to Jason Marjak, the director of the Adrian Arsh Latin American Center. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Cameron, and thanks to GT Institute for partnering with us in highlighting the importance and complexity of these short and long-term policies to give, as Vice President Harris has said, hope to those in Central America. Although the times may demand it, we cannot be drawn into thinking that reversing the region's trajectory is a quick fix. As living conditions in the Northern Triangle worsen, as citizens are forced to leave their countries in search of a better future, our program today was meant to get beyond the politics and the headlines and once again remind all of us that we must help to improve the lives of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, so that they have an alternative to leaving their homes, their communities. Doing so, as you saw, is not an easy decision, but it's one that people take every day when there is no other option, and we can work together to help create those options. That's why our Central America work focuses on a whole of society approach to addressing and finding new solutions to the most challenging issues facing the Northern Triangle. We will keep working on actionable recommendations to catalyze sustainable economic development, strengthen the rule of law, reduce conflict, and mitigate climate migration through our Northern Triangle Advisory Group. Special Envoy Zuniga, thank you for not only joining us today, but for taking on this important new post. Ricardo, I know we're in good shape with you leading this effort as the Special Envoy role. I'd also like to thank Oscar, Marcos, and Walter for your incredible perspectives on the human journey, my colleagues at the Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies for your partnership alongside the great work of my team in organizing today's discussion, Maria Fernanda Bosmansky, Domingo Sarduni, and Eva Narizabala. I'll leave you with a quote from one of Oscar's books that's right here behind me. Quote, "What is the solution? It's up to you. The crisis will be solved when people understand and worsens when they don't. It's that simple and it's that complicated." With that, everyone, have a good evening.